The water in the crystal carafe on table 14 did not ripple. It sat with an eerie, glass-like immutability, reflecting the amber glow of the electric chandeliers above. In any other setting, such stillness would be unremarkable, but here, in the middle of the North Atlantic, it was a miracle of engineering. This was the North Atlantic, a graveyard of 1,000 ships, a place defined by the violent heave of swells and the rhythmic stomach-churning pitch of the sea. Yet inside the D-deck dining saloon of the RMS Titanic, the ocean had been politely asked to stay outside. Isidore Strauss, the co-owner of Macy's, watched the surface of the water for a moment longer than necessary. He leaned back in his leather-upholstered chair, the starched white of his shirt front gleaming under his tuxedo. "It is quite extraordinary, Ida," he murmured, his voice barely audible over the hum of 100 simultaneous conversations. "One could almost forget we are moving at all." His wife, Ida, smiled across the table. She was draped in silk and lace, a sapphire pendant resting against her collarbone. "It isn't a ship, Isidore. It's a miracle. I've had tea in London hotels that felt more turbulence than this." Around them, the great hall was a theater of Edwardian opulence. The air was thick with the scent of roasted squab, expensive Havanas, and the faint, ozone-sweet smell of the ship's brand-new electric heaters. Waiters in white jackets glided over the deep-pile Axminster carpets like ghosts, carrying silver trays laden with poached salmon and bottles of Heidsieck champagne. The sound was a symphony of the elite, the staccato clink of silver against bone china, the rustle of silk gowns, and the melodic lilt of the ship's band playing the Tales of Huffman in the distance. This was the height of the golden hour. It was that fragile, beautiful window of time after dinner had been served, but before the night grew old, when everyone on board, from the billionaires in first class to the dreamers in the bowels of the ship, felt as though they had cheated fate. Outside the portholes, the temperature had plummeted to 33 degrees, and the sea had turned into a sheet of black glass. But inside, the Titanic was a sun. It was a 46,000-ton bubble of warmth, light, and staggering human hubris. Isidore reached out and finally took the carafe, pouring the water into his glass. As the liquid broke its perfect surface, a faint vibration, no more than a shiver, traveled through the floorboards. It was the heartbeats of the triple expansion engines, buried deep in the dark, pushing the ship toward a New York that felt closer with every revolution of the propellers. "To the White Star Line," Isidore said, raising his glass in a small, private toast, "for finally making the Atlantic behave." Ida clinked her glass against his. The crystal rang with a clear, sharp note that lingered in the warm air for a second too long. They did not look out the windows. There was no reason to. Behind the glass lay only the dark, and they were quite certain that the dark no longer held any power over them. On this Sunday night, the world was stable, the water was still, and the Titanic was the safest place in the history of man. The water in Isidore's glass settled once more. It was perfectly level. It was perfectly calm. It was the last moment of peace the world would ever truly know. Chapter 1. The Glass of Water. The dining saloon on D-deck was a cathedral of Edwardian ambition, a sprawling expanse of carved oak, white-painted alcoves, and the soft golden hum of 300 simultaneous conversations. It was 8:15 p.m. on Sunday, April 14, and the RMS Titanic was not merely a ship, it was a floating suspension of the laws of nature. At table 14, Isidore Strauss, the silver-haired patriarch of the Macy's department store empire, did not look at his menu. Instead, his gaze was fixed on a heavy crystal carafe positioned precisely in the center of the linen tablecloth. The water inside was a liquid mirror. It did not tremble. It did not sway. It sat with a terrifying, unnatural stillness that seemed to defy the fact that they were currently hurtling through the North Atlantic at 22 knots. "It is a triumph of silence, Ida," Isidore murmured, his voice rich with the quiet authority of a man who had spent his life measuring the value of things. He looked across the table at his wife. In 40 years of crossings, I have never felt the sea so defeated? Ida Strauss, draped in a gown of midnight blue silk with a collar of delicate Brussels lace, followed his gaze. She reached out a gloved hand, her fingers hovering just an inch from the glass. It's as if the world has stopped breathing just to let us pass. Do you remember the Adriatic in '99? The way the soup used to slide from one side of the bowl to the other? Isidore chuckled, a warm sound that was swallowed by the vast acoustics of the room. On the Adriatic, the ocean reminded you of your place in the world every 10 seconds. Here, Mr. Andrews and his engineers have relegated the Atlantic to a mere scenery. It is no longer an obstacle, it is a guest. The air in the saloon was an intoxicating blend of the expensive and the ephemeral. It smelled of roasted squab with cress, of Chateaubriand steak, and the sharp, citrusy zest of fresh sorbet. Underneath it all was the scent of the ship itself, the faint, clean aroma of new linseed oil, expensive Axminster carpets, and the dry, metallic tang of the electric heaters that lined the walls. To the passengers in first class, this was the smell of the future. Nearby, a steward in a crisp white jacket, a man named Thomas who had spent his career on the rolling, salt-sprayed decks of lesser liners, approached with a bottle of Heidsieck Monopole. He moved with a practiced, fluid grace, his feet finding purchase on a floor that felt as stable as a London sidewalk. "A quiet night, sir," Thomas remarked as he poured the champagne. The bubbles hissed softly, the only sound of agitation in the vicinity. "Extraordinarily so, Thomas," Isidore replied. "The vibration from the engine room. It's gone, isn't it?" "We've reached a steady revolution, sir. Captain Smith has the boilers at full pressure. She's finding her stride." Thomas moved away, his mind already on the 300 other diners, but Isidore remained captivated by the carafe. To a man of commerce, that stillness represented more than luxury. It represented the ultimate conquest of the chaotic by the orderly. The Titanic was the pinnacle of a century of steam and steel. It was a 46,000-ton middle finger to the gods of the abyss. Beyond the leaded glass windows, the temperature was plummeting. The Gulf Stream had been left behind hours ago, replaced by the biting, crystalline air of the Labrador Current. Outside, the sea was a desert of black glass, so flat and so calm that there wasn't even a line of white foam to mark where the hull sliced through the water. But here, inside the mahogany-paneled womb of the D-deck saloon, the cold was a rumor. Ida picked up her fork, her sapphire pendant catching the light of the electric chandeliers, a light that never flickered, never dimmed. She said, "I was speaking with Lady Duff Gordon earlier." She turned conspiratorial. "She says she feels a sense of expectation, as if we are racing towards something wonderful." Isidore nodded, finally breaking his gaze from the water to look at his wife. "We are racing toward a new age, Ida, a world where distance is irrelevant and the elements are optional." He lifted his glass of water. As he drank, he felt a faint, almost imperceptible shiver travel through the soles of his evening shoes. It wasn't a jolt, it was a rhythmic, low-frequency thrum, the heartbeat of the massive triple expansion engines 3 decks below. It was a reassurance of power, a promise of arrival. He set the glass back down. The water wobbled for a fraction of a second, sending a tiny ring of ripples towards the edge of the crystal, before settling back into its perfect, deceptive calm. "To a quiet night," Isidore said. "To a quiet night," Ida echoed. Neither of them looked towards the windows. There was no reason to. They were safe within the greatest machine ever built by human hands, surrounded by the finest people of their generation, drifting through a night that felt like an eternal golden afternoon. The iceberg was still miles away, hidden in the shadowless dark of a moonless sea, but for now, on table 14, the water was still, and in that stillness lay the most dangerous thing of all, the absolute, unwavering belief that the night would never end. The sun did not merely set on the evening of April 14. It surrendered with a bruised purple majesty, bleeding crimson across a horizon that seemed to stretch into the very end of the world. From the tall, arched windows of the Verandah Cafe and Palm Court, the sky looked like a canvas of cooling embers, the last vestiges of a day that felt too beautiful to be the final one. Evelyn Vance sat in a white wicker chair, the intricate weave of it pressing softly against her tea gown of pale cream silk. At 24, Evelyn possessed the kind of beauty that was often mistaken for fragility: pale skin, sharp features, and eyes the color of the Atlantic itself. But beneath the lace and the inheritance was a mind that observed the world with a clinical, almost restless precision. To her, this was the hour of the great suspension, that fragile bridge of time when the ship transitioned from a daytime marvel of locomotion into a nighttime palace of theater. The Verandah Cafe was an architectural lie, a piece of the Côte d'Azur stitched into the middle of a sub-zero ocean. The walls were covered in white trellis work draped with climbing ivy, and potted palms stood sentry in the corners, their fronds swaying with an almost imperceptible rhythm that mimicked a Mediterranean breeze. It was a deliberate deception, designed to make the billionaires of the Edwardian age feel as though they were in a garden in Cannes rather than a steel box suspended over a 2-mile abyss. "The cold is beginning to bite at the glass," her companion remarked, his voice cutting through her reverie. Julian sat opposite her, a man of sharp lapels and even sharper ambitions. He was currently preoccupied with the ritualistic task of lighting a gold-tipped cigarette, his movements polished by years of boarding schools and London clubs. He gestured with the burning match toward the windows. "Look at the haze on the panes, Evie. The temperature has dropped 10 degrees since we left the promenade. It's quite extraordinary." Evelyn turned her gaze from the dying sun to the glass. He was right. A fine, ghostly veil of condensation was blooming at the corners of the window frames, a crystalline frost that spoke of the true world outside. Out there, the air was becoming a weapon, a dry, sub-zero draft that would steal the breath from a man's lungs. But here, surrounded by the scent of fresh-baked scones, lemon curd, and the faint, citrusy trail of Earl Grey, the cold was merely an aesthetic choice. It was something to be looked at, like a painting in a gallery, but never truly felt. "It's a beautiful sort of cold, don't you think?" Evelyn asked, her voice tracing the curve of the horizon. It makes the light look sharper, brittle, as if the sky might crack if the ship's whistle blew too loudly. Julian laughed, a short, dry sound that lacked any real mirth. "The sky is the only thing that could crack out here, my dear. Certainly not this hull. I spoke with Colonel Gracie near the gymnasium. He told me the bridge has recorded a run of 546 miles since yesterday noon. We aren't just crossing the ocean, we are conquering it. At this rate, we'll be at the Chelsea piers so early on Wednesday that the press won't even have their cameras ready." Evelyn didn't respond. She was watching a steward move between the tables. He was a middle-aged man with a face lined by years of salt air, yet his movements were as rhythmic and certain as the tides. He was replacing the afternoon tea services with small crystal bowls of olives and nuts, the universal heralds of the cocktail hour. There was a profound, almost hypnotic sense of safety in these rituals. The Edwardian world was built on a foundation of should and must. The sun should set, the tea must be hot, and the Titanic must arrive. To suggest otherwise was not just pessimism, it was a breach of etiquette. The massive ship felt like a fortress, a 46,000-ton middle finger to the gods of the sea. She looked back out at the water. The Atlantic was no longer blue. It had turned a deep, bruised indigo, nearly black. The white foam generated by the ship's bow was the only thing that broke the darkness, a churning trail of lace that vanished into the wake. "Have you noticed the sea today, Julian?" she asked suddenly. "What about it? It's been remarkably cooperative." "It's more than cooperative. It's dead. There are no whitecaps, not a single ripple. My father used to say that a flat sea is a mocking sea, that it's hiding its temper until you've grown too comfortable to fight back. Julian waved away her concern with a cloud of blue smoke. Your father was a sailor of the old school, Evelyn. He dealt in canvas, hemp, and the whims of the wind. This, he tapped his polished shoe against the deck, is 46,000 tons of steel and 29 boilers. We don't fight the sea anymore. We simply ignore it. As if to punctuate his confidence, the ship's band began to play in the distance. The notes of a popular ragtime tune drifted through the palm court, bright, syncopated, and irreverent. It was the sound of a century that had no time for old superstitions. Evelyn watched the last sliver of the sun vanish beneath the edge of the world. For a fleeting second, a green flash, that rare optical phenomenon born of freezing air and a clear horizon, seemed to spark on the line where the sky met the water. It was a brilliant emerald wink, and then it was gone. The transition was complete. The golden hour had surrendered to the blue hour. The stewards began to move about the room with long brass tapers, lighting the silk-shaded lamps on the tables. One by one, small circles of warm, honeyed light pushed back the encroaching shadows of the Atlantic. The reflections of the wickered chairs, the ivy, and the palms appeared in the windows, masking the blackness outside. Now, the passengers could no longer see the ocean at all. They could only see themselves, reflected in the glass, draped in finery, glowing with the reflected light of their own creation. The ship had become a closed loop, a world that began and ended at the hull. "There," Julian said, satisfied as the room glowed with artificial warmth. "Much better. The dark is so terribly dreary, isn't it? It's a pity to let it in." Evelyn looked at her own reflection in the pane. Beyond her ghost-like image, she knew the ice was out there. She felt it in the way the air had turned crystalline, and in the eerie, velvet silence of the water. But the music was getting louder, and the room was getting warmer, and the illusion of immortality was far too beautiful to break. "Yes," she whispered, turning her back to the window. "Terribly dreary." She picked up her crystal glass, her diamonds catching the light of a lamp that would burn until the early hours of the morning. The night was quiet. The night was young, and in the Verandah cafe, it felt as though the spring would last forever, even as the temperature outside dropped to the freezing point of salt. If the dining saloon was the theater and the Verandah cafe was the lobby, then the staterooms of B deck were the dressing rooms, where the final, rigid illusions of the Edwardian era were meticulously constructed. By 7 p.m., a strange, rhythmic industry had taken over the ship. Behind the 1,000 mahogany doors, the air was thick with the scent of lavender water, singed hair from spirit lamp curling irons, and the sharp, clean smell of freshly starched linen. This was the ritual of the grand toilette, a transformation that was less about fashion and more about armor. In stateroom B52, Eleanor Shipley stood motionless as her maid, Marie, knelt at her feet, a mouthful of silver pins glinting in the electric light. Eleanor was a woman of 35, with a spine like a steel rod and a face that had been trained from birth to reveal nothing. Today, however, she felt a peculiar heaviness in the air. "The corset, Marie," Eleanor whispered, her hands gripping the edge of the marble-topped washstand. "Tighter." Marie paused, her brow furrowed. "Madame, the laces are already at their limit. You will find it difficult to breathe." "Breath is a secondary concern tonight," Eleanor replied, looking at her reflection. "Posture is everything." As the maid tugged, Eleanor felt the familiar crushing embrace of the whalebone stays. It was a physical manifestation of her life, narrow, structured, and uncompromising. To be a woman of her station on the Titanic was to be a living monument to propriety. Every layer of clothing was a barrier between herself and the raw, untamed world outside. First came the silk stockings held by ribbons, then the lace-trimmed chemise, followed by the corset cover, the silk petticoats that hissed like the sea with every step, and finally, the gown itself. Tonight, the gown was a masterpiece of midnight blue velvet, draped with an overlay of black chiffon that had been hand-beaded with thousands of tiny jet stones. It was heavy, nearly 15 pounds of fabric and glass, but it was magnificent. "The sapphire, madame?" Marie asked, opening a velvet-lined jewelry suite. Eleanor looked at the stone. It was a deep oceanic blue, the size of a pigeon's egg, suspended on a chain of platinum and diamonds. As Marie fastened the clasp, the cold metal sent a shiver down Eleanor's spine. She stared at herself in the triple-mirrored vanity, watching how the electric light danced across the gem. The light. That was the thing everyone noticed. On any other ship, the lamps would flicker or dim as the coal was shoveled into the furnaces. But on the Titanic, the light was constant, defiant, and blindingly white. It stripped away shadows. It made the sapphires look like fallen stars. A sharp knock at the door signaled the arrival of her husband, Arthur. He entered the room smelling of bay rum and the faint, earthy aroma of a pre-dinner sherry. He was a portrait of masculine geometry. His white waistcoat was a perfect, uncreased V. His wing collar was starched so stiffly it threatened to cut his jawline, and his black tailcoat fit him with the precision of a second skin. "You look formidable, Eleanor," he said, checking his gold pocket watch. It was 7:15 p.m. "The Astors are already moving toward the grand staircase. We shouldn't keep the evening waiting." "The evening isn't going anywhere, Arthur," Eleanor said, though she allowed him to drape her fur stole over her shoulders. The weight of the fur added to the burden of the velvet and the jewels. She felt anchored, bolted to the deck as securely as the grand piano in the lounge. As they stepped out into the corridor, the silence was what struck her most. The B-deck hallway was a long, carpeted artery of luxury, lined with polished woodwork and brass fixtures. The thick Axminster carpet swallowed the sound of their footsteps, creating a vacuum of noise that felt almost reverent. They passed other couples emerging from their suites, a parade of silk and starch. There was a silent competition in the air, a war of hemlines and cravats. They were all dressing for a world that they believed would last forever, a world where the greatest catastrophe was a misplaced soup spoon or a poorly tied necktie. As they reached the landing of the grand staircase, Eleanor paused. From this vantage point, she could look down into the heart of the ship. The ornate clock on the wall, flanked by the carved figures of honor and glory timing time, ticked with a steady, relentless precision. Above them, the great glass dome acted as a window to the night sky, though now it reflected only the brilliant interior light. Eleanor glanced up at the dome. Somewhere beyond that glass, the temperature was now well below freezing. The Atlantic was waiting, dark and indifferent. For a split second, the weight of her gown, the tightness of her corset, and the cold bite at the sapphire felt like a cage. She had a sudden irrational urge to strip it all off, to run onto the deck in nothing but her chemise and breathe in the killing air. "Eleanor?" Arthur prompted, offering his arm. "Is something wrong?" She blinked, the moment passing as quickly as a heartbeat. She adjusted her silk glove and placed her hand on his sleeve. The armor was back in place. The illusion was restored. "Nothing, Arthur," she said, her voice as polished as the mahogany banister. "I was just thinking that it's a remarkably quiet night." "It is indeed," Arthur agreed, leading her down the stairs toward the music and the wine. "The quietest on record." They descended into the light, two golden figures in a palace of glass, unaware that the very weight of the luxury they wore would soon be the very thing that pulled them toward the floor of the world. Chapter 3. Silk, Starch, and Sapphire. If the dining saloon was the ship's grand theater, and the Verandah Cafe its breezy lobby, then the staterooms of B-Deck or the private dressing rooms where the final rigid illusions of the Edwardian era were meticulously constructed. By 7 o'clock on that Sunday evening, a strange and rhythmic industry had taken hold of the Titanic. Behind 1,000 mahogany doors, the air had grown thick and heavy, a heady suspension of lavender-scented steam, the sulphurous tang of singed hair from spirit lamp curling irons, and the sharp, clinical smell of freshly starched linen. This was the ritual of the grand toilet. It was a transformation that transcended mere fashion. It was the forging of social armor, a deliberate layering of wealth and propriety designed to shield the wearer from the raw, untamed realities of the Atlantic world. In stateroom B52, Eleanor Shipley stood motionless, her arms raised slightly like a marble statue awaiting its finishing touches. Her maid, Marie, knelt at her feet with a mouthful of silver pins, her brow furrowed in the intense concentration of a master craftsman. Eleanor was a woman of 35, possessing a spine like a steel rod and a face that had been trained from the nursery to reveal absolutely nothing of her internal weather. But tonight, she felt a peculiar atmospheric heaviness, a pressure in the air that the electric heaters could not quite dispel. "The corset, Marie," Eleanor whispered, her knuckles whitening as she gripped the edge of the marble-topped washstand. "Tighter. I can still feel the air in my lungs." Marie paused, looking up with a worried squint. "Madame, the laces are already at their absolute limit. The whalebone is bowing. You will find it difficult to sit, let alone breathe. Breath is a secondary concern tonight. Posture is the only thing that separates us from the steerage. Pull." With a sharp intake of breath, Marie tugged. Eleanor felt the familiar, crushing embrace of the stays, a physical manifestation of her life's structure. It was an uncompromising cage that forced her shoulders back and her heart up, a cage that dictated exactly how much of the world she was allowed to let in. To be a woman of her station on the Titanic was to be a living monument to stability. Every layer was a barrier. First, the silk stockings held by ribbons of French lace, then the camise, the corset cover, 3 layers of silk petticoats that hissed like the receding tide with every movement, and finally, the gown itself. The gown was a masterpiece of midnight blue velvet, so dark it bordered on obsidian. It was draped with an overlay of black chiffon that had been hand-beaded with thousands of tiny jet stones. It was a heavy garment, nearly 15 pounds of fabric and glass, but it was magnificent. It lent her a gravity that felt appropriate for a ship of such immense proportions. "The sapphire, madam?" Marie asked, opening a velvet-lined jewelry suite that sat on the dressing table like a small, dark altar. Eleanor looked at the stone. It was a deep oceanic blue, a Logan sapphire the size of a pigeon's egg, suspended on a chain of platinum and brilliant cut diamonds. As Marie fastened the clasp, the chilled metal sent a predatory shiver down Eleanor's spine. She stared at the gem, watching how the ship's electric light danced within its facets. The light on the Titanic was unlike the light on any other vessel Eleanor had ever known. On the older liners, the lamps would flicker or grow amber dim as the coal was shoveled into the furnaces far below. But here, the light was constant, defiant, and blindingly white. It stripped away shadows, it made the sapphires look like fallen stars, and the silk look like liquid metal. It created a world of absolute clarity, where the dark outside the portholes simply ceased to exist. A sharp, rhythmic knock at the door signaled the arrival of her husband, Arthur. He entered the room smelling of bay rum, expensive leather, and the faint, earthy aroma of a pre-dinner sherry. Arthur was a portrait of masculine geometry. His white waistcoat was a perfect uncreased V, his wing collar was starched so stiffly it threatened to cut his jawline, and his black tailcoat fit him with the airless precision of a second skin. "You look formidable, Eleanor," he said, checking his gold pocket watch with a snap of the casing. It was 7:15 p.m. The Astors and the Guggenheims are already moving toward the grand staircase. We shouldn't keep the evening waiting. "The evening isn't going anywhere, Arthur," Eleanor said, though she allowed him to drape her silver fox stole over her shoulders. The additional weight of the fur felt like an anchor. She felt bolted to the deck, as securely fastened as the grand piano in the lounge or the massive boilers in the hold. As they stepped out into the B-deck corridor, the silence of the ship struck her once again. The hallway was a long carpeted artery of luxury, lined with polished mahogany and brass fixtures that caught the light in long, golden streaks. The thick Axminster carpets swallowed the sound of their footsteps, creating a vacuum of noise that felt almost reverent, like the interior of a cathedral. They passed other couples emerging from their suites, a slow-moving parade of silk, starch, and sapphire. There was a silent, desperate competition in the air, a war of hemlines and cravats played out in the hushed tones of the elite. They were all dressing for a world that they believed would last forever, a world where the greatest possible catastrophe was a misplaced soup spoon or a poorly tied necktie. As they reached the landing of the grand staircase, Eleanor paused, her hand resting on the cool carved wood of the banister. From this vantage point, she could look down into the very heart of the ship's social engine. The ornate clock on the wall, flanked by the bronzed figures of honor and glory crowning time, ticked with a steady, relentless precision. Above them, the great wrought iron and glass dome acted as a window to the heavens, though now it reflected only the brilliant interior glow, masking the stars. Eleanor glanced up at the dome. Somewhere beyond that glass, the temperature had plummeted to well below freezing. The Atlantic was waiting out there, vast, indifferent, and hungry. For a fleeting, irrational second, the weight of her gown, the crushing grip of her corset, and the cold bite of the sapphire felt like a burial shroud. She had a sudden, terrifying urge to strip it all off, to run onto the upper deck in nothing but her camise and breathe in the killing air until her lungs froze solid. "Arthur?" Eleanor prompted, offering her arm with a slight, impatient tilt of his head. "Is something wrong? You've gone quite pale." She blinked, the moment of clarity passing as quickly as a heartbeat. She adjusted her silk glove, smoothing a non-existent wrinkle, and placed her hand on his sleeve. The armor was back in place. The illusion was restored. "Nothing, Arthur," Eleanor said, her voice as polished and hollow as the mahogany surrounding them. "I was just thinking that it is a remarkably quiet night." "It is indeed," Arthur agreed, leading her down the stairs toward the music, the wine, and the warmth. "The quietest on record. A night for the history books, I should think." They descended into the light, two golden figures in a palace of glass and steel, entirely unaware that the very weight of the luxury they wore would be the very thing that accelerated their journey toward the floor of the world. Chapter 4. The Gastronomic Waltz. The first-class dining saloon on D-Deck was not merely a room, it was a 114-foot-wide cathedral of consumption, a sprawling shrine to the Gilded Age's belief that nature could not only be tamed, but could be forced to wait at the table. As the clock on the bulkhead crept toward the half-hour past 8, the room reached its social and sensory crescendo. This was the heart of the Gastronomic Waltz, a 10-course performance of staggering complexity, where the dancers were white-jacketed stewards and the music was the rhythmic staccato clink of sterling silver against bone china. To Major Archibald Butt, the military aide to President Taft and a man who had navigated the shark-infested waters of Washington politics for decades, the room felt like the final fortress of civilization. He sat at a central table, his back straight, his chest adorned with the subtle glints of military medals. The air around him was a heavy, intoxicating suspension of truffle-infused Madeira sauce, the floral, powdery notes of expensive French perfumes, and the sharp, clean ozone of the ship's cooling system. The architecture itself seemed designed to induce a sense of divine safety. The walls, paneled in mahogany but painted a creamy, luminous white, were carved with delicate Jacobean flourishes that caught the glow of the recessed electric lights. Above, the ceiling was a vast expanse of white painted steel, yet it had been crafted to appear as light as a summer cloud. There were no visible rivets here, no grease, no soot. The industrial skeleton of the ship had been buried under layers of aesthetic grace, ensuring that no billionaire need ever be reminded they were currently being propelled through a 3-mile-deep void by the violent combustion of coal. I have dined at the White House under 3 administrations and in the grandest embassies of the Faubourg Saint-Germain, Major Butt remarked to his table companions, his voice carrying the calm resonance of a practiced diplomat. But I have never seen a room so profoundly indifferent to its own geography. We are in the middle of a wasteland, yet I feel as though I am in a private club on Pall Mall. His friend, the artist and war correspondent Francis Millet, nodded slowly as he lifted a spoonful of consommé Olga, a broth so clear and delicate it looked like liquid amber, garnished with the finest shavings of scallops and celery. "It is the stillness that unnerves me, Archie," Millet replied, his eyes tracing the level of the wine in his glass. On the Adriatic or the Oceanic, the soup acted as a sort of liquid pendulum, telling you exactly where the Atlantic was trying to push you. Here, the liquid is as immobile as a spirit level. It's almost a form of hubris. We haven't just crossed the ocean, we've ignored it. We've told the currents to move around us, and for the moment, they are obeying. The choreography of the service was a marvel of Victorian logistics, executed by a small army of stewards who moved with the silent, obsequious grace of automatons. They carried heavy silver platters laden with filet mignons Lily, poached salmon drizzled with mousseline sauce, and roast duckling prepared with Calvados-soaked apples. Each course was a calculated layer of luxury, a deliberate attempt to drown out the reality of the environment beyond the steel hull. But beneath the high-pitched chatter of the elite and the melodic, distant strains of the orchestra playing selections from the tales of Hoffmann, there was a deeper, more visceral sound. It was a low-frequency thrum that resonated not in the ears, but in the soles of the diners' feet. It was the propellant of the ship's immense ambition. 3 decks below, 29 boilers were screaming with the pressure of 1,000 tons of coal, and the 3 massive bronze propellers were biting into the frigid water at 75 revolutions per minute. The Titanic wasn't merely moving, she was lunging. "I heard a rumor on the bridge this afternoon," a man at a neighboring table whispered, leaning in with the conspiratorial air of a stock jobber. "Captain Smith has ordered the last of the boilers to be lit. We aren't just making time, we are making history. The chairman wants us to arrive in New York on Tuesday night. Imagine the headlines. The world will stop spinning for a day." Major Butt looked toward the windows. The leaded glass was dark, reflecting only the brilliant interior of the saloon. To anyone inside, the Atlantic Ocean had ceased to be a physical reality. It had been reduced to a theoretical backdrop, a stage curtain that would never be pulled back. They were encased in 46,000 tons of arrogance, a steel bubble of light and warmth that felt entirely disconnected from the physical laws of the natural world. The 7th course arrived, the punch romaine. It was a palate cleanser of shaved ice, champagne, and lemon, served in delicate, long-stemmed crystal. It was a cold, sharp shock to the system, a culinary mimicry of the air outside. But for the diners, the ice was a novelty, a luxury to be consumed and laughed over. They turned the frozen slush over their tongues, oblivious to the fact that they were eating the very substance that was currently waiting for them in the dark.
"The ice is particularly refreshing tonight," a woman laughed, her voice like a silver bell. Her diamonds caught the light of 1,000 electric bulbs, flashing with a fire that seemed to promise immortality. As the 8th course, roast squab and cress, was cleared and the rich, earthy scent of cigars began to drift from the adjacent smoking room, the atmosphere in the saloon shifted. It was the heavy, contented glow of a society at its zenith. These were the architects of the modern age, the men who moved markets and the women who dictated culture. They believed in the permanence of the empire, the infallibility of the machine, and the ultimate safety of their own brilliance. But Major Butt felt a sudden, fleeting chill. It wasn't a draft, the ship's heating system was a triumph of the age, but a psychological shiver. He looked at the white-painted pillars, the heavy velvet curtains, and the hundreds of happy, oblivious faces. For a second, the room felt terrifyingly fragile, like a piece of exquisite, paper-thin porcelain being held over a jagged stone floor by a tired hand. "Are you quite well, Archie? You've gone a bit distant," Millet noted, reaching for the decanter of Burgundy. Butt shook off the sensation, forcing a smile as he reached for his own glass. The wine was a deep, bruised red, reflecting the chandeliers like a faceted garnet. "I was just thinking," he said softly, "about the silence. It's so quiet tonight, Francis. No wind, no spray, just this absolute velvet stillness. It's as if the whole world is holding its breath." "It's the sound of progress, Archie," Millet replied, raising his glass in a small, steady toast. "The old world was loud and messy. The new world is quiet and efficient. Enjoy it. We shall likely never see a night this perfect again." They clinked their glasses, a clear, sharp ring that hung in the air for a moment too long. Outside, the temperature had reached the freezing point of salt water. The lookouts in the crow's nest were straining their eyes into a blackness so absolute it felt solid, their faces numb from the biting draft of 22 knots. But in the dining saloon, the waltz continued. The coffee was being roasted, the port was being poured, and the dream of the golden night remained unbroken.
Chapter 5. Fiddles and Stout. If the upper decks of the Titanic were the ship's polished brain, calculating, serene, and aloof, then G-deck was its thumping, visceral heart. Down here, in the forward and aft sections of the hull, where the steel began to curve toward the keel, the quiet night was a different creature altogether. It was not the silence of velvet and silk, but the rowdy, sweat-soaked, and fiercely hopeful clamor of the world's diaspora. Daniel O'Shea sat on a bolted wooden bench in the third-class general room, his back pressed against a white-painted bulkhead that hummed with a constant low-frequency vibration. At 20 years old, Daniel possessed nothing but a cardboard suitcase, a change of rough wool clothes, and a scuffed fiddle case that had traveled from the peat-smoked cottages of County Cork. To him, the air in the general room was a thick, humid soup, a heady mix of yeasty black stout, pungent pipe tobacco, the lingering steam of boiled cabbage from the evening meal, and the unmistakable aroma of 700 bodies packed into a steel box. Yet to Daniel and the hundreds around him, this wasn't the smell of poverty. It was the smell of oxygen. It was the scent of an ending and a beginning. In the first-class dining saloon, conversation was a delicate fencing match of wit and status. Here on G-deck, it was a glorious cacophony. A group of Scandinavians in the corner were engaged in a hushed, intense game of cards, their voices a rhythmic rumble of vowels. Across the room, a Lebanese family sat in a tight, protective circle, the mother whispering ancient stories of the cedars of home to children whose eyes were wide with the terrifying, marvelous hum of the great machine. "Give us a tune, Danny," a voice barked over the din. It was a man named Murphy, whose hands were calloused from a lifetime of shoveling coal in the Belfast shipyards. "Something to make the boilers jealous, something to drive the damp out of our bones." Daniel didn't need a second invitation. He drew his bow across the strings, and the first sharp, biting notes of the Star of Munster sliced through the humid air. The fiddle was old, its wood darkened by decades of kitchen fires and pub sessions, but it sang with a piercing, rhythmic joy that demanded a response. The rhythm of G-deck was not the gastronomic waltz.
It was the thunderous, synchronized stomp of hobnailed boots on linoleum-covered steel. It was the frantic, joyous blur of a jig that defied the social gravity of the world above. As the music swelled, the very vibration of the ship seemed to synchronize with the dance. Down here, closer to the waterline, you didn't just hear the engines, you lived within their heartbeat. To the billionaires on B deck, the ship felt stationary, a stationary hotel floating on a pond. To the immigrants on G deck, the Titanic felt like a living, breathing beast, a 46,000-ton iron horse galloping through the dark toward a horizon made of New York gold. Getting down here is free. Getting out is part of your $22 ticket. "She's moving tonight, isn't she, Danny?" a girl named Mary said, breathless as she spun past him in the center of the clearing. Her face was flushed a vibrant pink, her auburn hair escaping its pins in wild, damp wisps. "Give us a tune, Danny," a voice barked over the din. It was a man named Murphy, whose hands were calloused from a lifetime of shoveling coal in the Belfast shipyards. "Something to make the boilers jealous, something to drive the damp out of our bones." Daniel didn't need a second invitation. He drew his bow across the strings, and the first sharp, biting notes of the Star of Munster sliced through the humid air. The fiddle was old, its wood darkened by decades of kitchen fires and pub sessions, but it sang with a piercing, rhythmic joy that demanded a response. The rhythm of G-Deck was not the gastronomic waltz. It was the thunderous, synchronized stomp of hobnailed boots on linoleum-covered steel. It was the frantic, joyous blur of a jig that defied the social gravity of the world above. As the music swelled, the very vibration of the ship seemed to synchronize with the dance. Down here, closer to the waterline, you didn't just hear the engines, you lived within their heartbeat. To the billionaires on B deck, the ship felt stationary, a stationary hotel floating on a pond. To the immigrants on G deck, the Titanic felt like a living, breathing beast, a 46,000-ton iron horse galloping through the dark toward a horizon made of New York gold. Getting down here is free. Getting out is part of your $22 ticket. "She's moving tonight, isn't she, Danny?" a girl named Mary said, breathless as she spun past him in the center of the clearing. Her face was flushed a vibrant pink, her auburn hair escaping its pins in wild, damp wisps. "Give us a tune, Danny," a voice barked over the din. It was a man named Murphy, whose hands were calloused from a lifetime of shoveling coal in the Belfast shipyards. "Something to make the boilers jealous, something to drive the damp out of our bones." Daniel didn't need a second invitation. He drew his bow across the strings, and the first sharp, biting notes of the Star of Munster sliced through the humid air. The fiddle was old, its wood darkened by decades of kitchen fires and pub sessions, but it sang with a piercing, rhythmic joy that demanded a response. The rhythm of G-Deck was not the gastronomic waltz. It was the thunderous, synchronized stomp of hobnailed boots on linoleum-covered steel. It was the frantic, joyous blur of a jig that defied the social gravity of the world above. As the music swelled, the very vibration of the ship seemed to synchronize with the dance. Down here, closer to the waterline, you didn't just hear the engines, you lived within their heartbeat. To the billionaires on B deck, the ship felt stationary, a stationary hotel floating on a pond. To the immigrants on G deck, the Titanic felt like a living, breathing beast, a 46,000-ton iron horse galloping through the dark toward a horizon made of New York gold.
As the night deepened toward 11 o'clock, the frantic energy of the dance began to mellow into a communal, weary peace. The Stout ran low in the barrels, and the fiddler finally rested his aching bow. A strange, heavy quiet settled over the room, a third-class version of the stillness that had gripped the rest of the ship. A group of men sat near the massive, white-painted rivets of the hull, leaning their heads back against the cold steel. On the other side of that half-inch of metal, the North Atlantic was rushing past at a terrifying speed. a wall of black water at a temperature that would stop a man's heart in less than 3 minutes. But inside, the rivets felt solid. They felt eternal. They felt like the very definition of safety. "It's a queer sort of night," Murphy remarked, puffing on a short clay pipe. "I went up to the steerage promenade for a bit of air a moment ago. No wind, no waves, just a sea like a sheet of black glass. I've never seen the water so shy." "It's the luck of the Irish, Murph," another man replied, his voice thick with the onset of sleep. "The unsinkable has frightened the sea into behaving. We'll be in New York with dry shoes and a full stomach, boys. Just you wait." They raised their mugs, some filled with dregs of bitter ale, others with tepid tea, in a silent, hopeful toast to the miracle of the age. They were the dreamers in the basement of the world, the laborers and domestic servants who were betting their entire lives on a future they couldn't yet see, protected by a technology they didn't fully understand. Daniel packed his fiddle away, the wood still warm from the friction of the bow. He looked around the room, at the sleeping children curled on their mothers' laps, the whispering lovers in the shadows, and the old men staring at the ceiling as if they could see through the decks to the stars. There was so much hope in this room that it felt heavy. It was a weight more substantial than the steel of the hull or the weight of the coal in the bunkers. He walked toward his berth, passing the massive, silent, watertight doors that stood like iron sentinels in the corridors. He didn't know the physics of buoyancy or the mathematics of flooded compartments. He only knew that he had been told the ship was a fortress. He climbed into his narrow bunk, the rhythmic, powerful thrum of the propellers acting as a mechanical lullaby. The night was quiet. The night was still. And deep in the belly of the Titanic, 700 people fell asleep dreaming of a city of lights, unaware that the black water was only inches away, separated from them by nothing more than a few million rivets and the fragile, beautiful arrogance of man. The fiddle was silent. The dance was over. But the ship raced on through the mirror-flat sea, a palace of dreams held together by a silence that was, at that very moment, seconds away from being shattered forever.
Chapter 6. Whispers in the Smoking Room. If the dining saloon was the heart of the ship's social body, bright, inclusive, and performative, then the first-class smoking room on A deck was its brooding, masculine soul. It was a space defined by the heavy weight of mahogany, the scent of expensive oxblood leather, and the slow, deliberate consumption of time. As the night of April 14th deepened toward its 11th hour, the room was thick with a sepia-toned haze, a fragrant, swirling fog of hand-rolled Havana leaf, and the peaty amber breath of aged Scotch. Benjamin Guggenheim, the mining magnate whose name was synonymous with the iron and gold foundations of the American century, sat ensconced in a deep club chair near the aft bulkhead. He was a man who moved through the world with the effortless, almost predatory grace of those who have never known the word no. In his hand, a crystal snifter of Hennessy caught the flickering orange-red light from the large coal-burning fireplace, the only one of its kind ever installed on a vessel at sea. The flames cast dancing, elongated shadows across the room's most celebrated feature, the magnificent stained glass windows depicting Old Mother Hubbard and scenes of the hunt, which glowed with an inner artificial light that defiantly ignored the black void pressing against the hull. "The speed is palpable tonight, Ben," remarked Colonel Archibald Gracie, an amateur historian and man of letters who sat opposite him. Gracie gestured with his cigar, a long silver-gray ash clinging precariously to its tip, toward the subtle, high-frequency vibration in the floorboards. "I spoke with Ismay near the grand staircase earlier. He's practically vibrating himself. They've lit the last of the boilers. They're looking to shave a full day off the Olympics record. It's a bold play, especially given the drop in the glass." Guggenheim swirled his brandy, watching the way the viscous liquid clung to the sides of the crystal like liquid silk. Boldness is the only currency the world recognizes, Colonel. If Captain Smith didn't push her, we'd be no better than a common cross-channel ferry. This ship was built to humiliate the Atlantic, not to negotiate with it. Let the stokers sweat in their hell. I intend to be in Manhattan in time for a very long lunch on Wednesday. The whispers of the smoking room were the whispers of global power. In this room, the world wealth was being reorganized over games of bridge and high-stakes poker. Men in starched white cravats and velvet-collared evening coats discussed the rising tide of the labor unions in the North, the volatility of the copper markets in the West, and the inevitable expansion of the railroads into the heart of the continent. There was an intoxicating, almost religious sense of invincibility here. The walls were paneled in carved Georgian mahogany, intricately inset with mother-of-pearl and marquetry, creating an environment so sturdy and opulent that the very notion of a shipwreck felt like a Gothic ghost story, a relic of a primitive wooden past that had no place in this new age of steel and electricity. Near the center of the room, a high-stakes poker game was in progress. The players were silent, save for the dry, percussive thwack of cards hitting the green baize-covered table and the occasional metallic clink of a silver lighter. These were men who gambled with empires. A $1,000 pot was merely a way to pass the time between the brandy and the bed. They did not look at the windows. None of them did. If they had, they would have seen the frost beginning to lace the edges of the glass, a delicate crystalline warning that the physical world was reasserting itself. The temperature in the smoking room was kept at a steady, artificial 70 degrees, but just 3 inches of wood and steel away, the world had turned into a killing floor. The thermometer on the bridge had hit 31 degrees, and the air was so dry and so cold that it felt like inhaling needles. A quiet night for it, wouldn't you say? A steward whispered to his colleague as they stood by the service bar, polished silver trays tucked under their white-gloved arms. "Too quiet, if you ask me," the other replied, his voice barely audible over the low murmur of the room. "Have you seen the sea from the A-deck promenade? It's like a pond. My old man served on the T-clippers. He used to say that when the sea goes flat like an obsidian mirror, it's because it's waiting for something to fall in. It's holding its breath." Nonsense. This is the Titanic. Even the Atlantic knows its place when Mr. Andrews is at the drawing board.
The steward moved off to refill Guggenheim's glass. As he approached the side table, he noticed a faint, rhythmic rattling. A small silver ash receiver was shivering, a high-frequency tremor born of the 3 massive bronze propellers pushing the ship to its absolute limit of 22.5 knots. It was the only sign of the violent struggle occurring 100 feet below. The firemen's blackened lungs, the white-hot roar of the furnaces, and the immense groaning strain on the steel propeller shafts. But here, in the sanctuary of the smoking room, it was just a minor curiosity, a faint percussion to the low murmur of aristocratic conversation. Guggenheim leaned back, his eyes half closed in a state of perfect, gilded contentment. "You know, Gracie, there is a certain poetry to this night. We are in a palace of light, drifting through a world of absolute shadow. We are, for this moment, the only things that exist for 1,000 miles in any direction. It's the ultimate privacy, the ultimate triumph of man over the void." "It's the luxury of the closed loop," Gracie corrected, tapping his ash into the silver tray. "The luxury of not having to care what lies beyond the door, because we've built a door that cannot be broken." They fell into a comfortable silence, the kind shared by men who believe the world is their servant. The clock on the mantel, a masterpiece of gilded bronze and marble, ticked with a steady, relentless precision toward 11:30 p.m. The cigars burned down to white ash, the brandy reached the bottom of the snifter, the cards were dealt for what would be the final hand of the night. The whispers in the room were confident, steady, and low. They spoke of futures and fortunes, of marriages and mergers. No one spoke of the ice. To speak of the ice would be to admit that there was something in the dark that did not answer to a bank account, a pedigree, or a board of directors. The Titanic surged forward, a 46,000-ton bullet of light aimed at the heart of the North Atlantic. And in the smoking room, the fire continued to crackle, the mahogany continued to gleam, and the men continued to whisper, wrapped in a silence so profound that they didn't even hear the ice coming until the first shudder began, a long, grinding sigh that sounded for one terrifying second like the ship was finally, agonizingly, taking a breath.